Welcome to the Criminal Minds. Today's story is about a 27-year-old medical student named Brian Shaffer, who went to a bar with friends to celebrate spring break, but is never seen walking out. Brian Shaffer was the kind of person whose presence could light up a room before he even stepped through the door. His laughter was infectious, his ambitions towering, and his compassion quietly unwavering. For those who knew him, Brian wasn't just another medical student at Ohio State University. He was someone who made the future seem limitless. Born on February 25, 1979, in Pickerington, Ohio, Brian was the oldest of two boys. His younger brother Derek would often describe him as a protector and a best friend. Their parents, Randy and Renee Shaffer, were high school sweethearts who built a modest but loving home in the suburbs. From a young age, Brian was curious about the world, spending hours exploring the woods behind their house, reading voraciously, and asking questions that made adults pause before answering. Randy worked as a contractor, while Renee was a nurse, a career that, in many ways, shaped Brian's early fascination with medicine. He wasn't the type to pull the wings off insects or laugh at others' pain. Instead, he was drawn to healing, to understanding how things worked, and to ease and discomfort in others. Renee would later recall how, as a boy, Brian once cried over a hurt bird he found in the backyard. He tried to make it a bed, fed it water from a dropper, and cried when it didn't survive. She knew then that his heart was bigger than most. High school came easily to Brian. His magnetic personality made him popular, but he wasn't arrogant or exclusive. He played guitar, flirted with the idea of being in a band, and loved Pearl Jam. So much so that their lyrics would later form an eerie thread in his story. His academic performance was strong, and teachers noted his sharp memory and calm demeanor under pressure. After graduation, Brian attended Ohio State University for his undergraduate degree, where he majored in microbiology. His charisma never waned. Professors liked him, students gravitated toward him, and he continued to play guitar, sometimes performing at campus events. But beneath the surface, Brian carried a burden most didn't see. In 2005, tragedy struck the Shaffer family. Renee, the heart of their home and Brian's greatest supporter, was diagnosed with myelodysplastic syndrome, a form of cancer that would ultimately take her life. She passed away in March 2006, just weeks before Brian disappeared. Her death devastated Brian. Friends noticed a shift in him, not drastic, but unmistakable. He was quieter and more introspective. He still smiled, but there was something else behind his eyes. He began talking more about the brevity of life, even jokingly telling friends that maybe he'd just disappear one day, move to an island, and play music for the rest of his life. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than grief-fueled escapism. Despite his emotional turmoil, Brian pushed on. He was in his second year at Ohio State's College of Medicine and was excelling. He'd been dating Alexis Wagner, a fellow med student, for over a year. She was brilliant, grounded, and adored Brian. The two had planned a trip to Miami for spring break. Unknown to Alexis, Brian had reportedly been considering proposing during the trip. Brian wasn't running from life. He was building one. But grief is a tricky companion. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. It curls into the edges of your thoughts and rewrites the meaning of joy. For Brian, the loss of his mother may have deepened his sense of impermanence, of life's fragility. Yet, there was no sign that he was planning anything drastic. By late March 2006, Brian was juggling a heavy academic load, nurturing a promising relationship, and preparing for a much-needed vacation. Spring had come to Columbus, and the city buzzed with students ready to blow off steam. On March 31st, he made plans to unwind with friends. It was the start of spring break. Classes were done and exams finished. Brian's last text to Alexis that day was simple. "Good luck on your test. I'll see you soon." She smiled when she read it. She had no reason to think it would be the last message she'd ever get from him. Spring in Columbus, Ohio, was an event in itself. The cold grip of winter released its hold slowly, reluctantly, as if daring the sun to reclaim the sky. When it finally did, the city transformed. Outdoor patios opened. Sidewalks buzzed with students. Laughter echoed down alleys. For Ohio State University's sprawling campus, the season meant more than weather. It meant release. Students walked faster, talked louder, and stayed out longer. Final exams were behind them, and the haze of spring break promised escape. This atmosphere, alive and electric, is where Brian Shaffer spent his last known hours. On Friday, March 31st, Brian met his father, Randy, for a quick dinner. They talked about the upcoming trip, and Renee. This was her first spring without her, and both men felt the absence like a physical weight. But they didn't dwell on it. Randy remembered Brian seeming tired, maybe from late nights or stress, but otherwise fine. They hugged goodbye, neither knowing it would be their last. That evening, around 9 p.m., Brian met up with his friend William Clint Florence. Clint was a bit more reserved than Brian, but their friendship worked. The plan was a low-key bar crawl to celebrate the start of the break. Another friend, Meredith Reed, would join them later. Their first stop was the North High Street area. Bars like the Arena, Brothers, and Lucky's were packed. Brian was drinking, but not heavily. He wasn't known to overdo it. He flirted, laughed, and took photos with strangers. According to those around him, Brian was in good spirits, even telling one acquaintance he was excited for Miami and needed the ocean. Around 1 a.m., the group decided to end the night at a place called the Ugly Tuna Saloona, tucked away in the South Campus Gateway. It wasn't glamorous, but it was popular. It had one main escalator entrance, with CCTV cameras positioned at the top. Meredith drove them there and parked nearby. The bar was on the second floor, accessible by that single visible escalator. Brian was captured by security footage at 1:15 a.m., riding up with Clint and Meredith. He was smiling, wearing jeans and a short-sleeved polo. Inside, they ordered drinks. At some point, Brian stepped away from the group, perhaps to talk to someone, to use a restroom, or just to get some air. This was normal for him. He was independent and often wandered during nights out. Clint and Meredith lost track of him but assumed he'd reappear. When the bar closed around 2 a.m., they waited near the exit. But Brian never came out. Surveillance footage shows Clint and Meredith leaving, but Brian is not seen again, not going down the escalator, not exiting through the front. Nothing. It was as if he had evaporated. Later, police would scrutinize that footage frame by frame. There were other patrons, other movements, some faces blurred, some left in groups. But Brian, unmistakably tall and athletic, with a distinctive gait, never walked back out. By the time Clint and Meredith got home, they were annoyed, not alarmed. Maybe he caught a ride. Maybe he ran into someone he knew. Maybe he went home early. But Brian wasn't home. The next morning, Alexis tried calling him on Saturday. No response. She wasn't immediately concerned. He might have crashed at Clint's or simply slept in. But as the hours passed and texts went unread, concern shifted to worry. Brian didn't usually disappear. He always answered, even if it was just a short reply. By Sunday, panic set in. Alexis called his father. Derek tried his phone. Friends reached out. Nothing. No one had seen or heard from him since that bar. His phone rang a few times that day, strangely, but eventually went to voicemail. The ringing sparked hope, but it was false. The phone was either malfunctioning or had power, but no signal. GPS tracking was limited at the time. They had no way to locate him. By Monday, April 3rd, Brian was reported missing. The Columbus Police Department began with logical questions. Was Brian depressed? Did he have enemies? Any medical conditions? Any indication he'd wanted to disappear? None of it added up. He had plans. He was thriving academically. He was deeply in love. Yes, he was grieving, but those closest to him insisted that he wasn't spiraling. If anything, he was trying harder than ever to move forward. Inside, the Ugly Tuna was bustling. Music thumped through speakers. Lights flashed red and blue. People danced, drank, flirted. Brian, Clint, and Meredith joined the crowd. At some point, the three were separated. This wasn't unusual. The bar was busy, and Brian often wandered during nights out. He was known to strike up conversations with strangers or duck out for a cigarette or air, even though he didn't smoke much. Around 1:55 a.m., security footage catches Brian once again. He's standing just outside the entrance to the bar, talking briefly to two women. He appears relaxed, engaged, and smiling. A few seconds later, he steps back into the bar, presumably to find Clint or Meredith or to use the restroom. That is the last image ever captured of him. Police reviewed hours of footage. Dozens of patrons were seen arriving and leaving. Clint and Meredith are recorded exiting the bar shortly before 2:10 a.m., just before closing time. Brian is not with them. He is not seen on the escalator again. He is not seen walking down the hallway to the back. He is not seen exiting any door. At first, investigators believe he must have slipped past the camera, perhaps in a blind spot, perhaps disguised or ducked low behind a group of patrons. But even after identifying and interviewing nearly everyone who left the bar that night, no one remembered seeing Brian. No one reported him leaving with them. No one saw him again. There were rumors of a hidden exit, or that he might have left through a service area. Police explored every possibility. Dogs were brought in. The area was searched: dumpsters, rooftops, sewers. But there was nothing. No trace. Not even a hint. It was as if the ugly tuna had swallowed him whole. By Tuesday, April 4th, the story was public. Flyers with Brian's face were taped to light posts and coffee shop windows. Local news aired segments. His medical school friends formed search teams. Social media wasn't what it is today, but word spread quickly on message boards and forums. The image used on the poster showed Brian with his characteristic scruffy beard, wide smile, and warm eyes. Missing was printed in bold at the top, but nothing about him fit the usual mold. He wasn't troubled. He didn't have a history of running. He had plans, love, and ambition. No one vanishes like this. Not sober, not in front of cameras, not in a bar filled with people. But Brian did. Police questioned both Meredith Reed and Clint Florence extensively. Meredith was cooperative. Clint, however, became increasingly withdrawn. He refused to take a polygraph test. Though legally within his rights, Clint's refusal fueled speculation. Why would a friend, one of the last people to see Brian alive, now do everything possible to help clear the air? Some said it was fear. Others suggested guilt. Not necessarily of wrongdoing, but perhaps of negligence or omission. Had Clint and Brian argued? Had something happened that night they didn't want to be made public? There was no evidence tying Clint to anything sinister. But in a vacuum, silence becomes its kind of suspicion. As the investigation continued, police began tracing Brian's digital life. Credit cards, bank accounts, social media, email, phone records, all of it stopped cold after April 1st. He had made no ATM withdrawals that night. His credit card was never used again. His bank account sat untouched. He hadn't posted, texted, or called anyone after that last text to Alexis. Good luck on your test. If he had left voluntarily, he had done so with an almost impossible level of precision, leaving no trace, no plan, no signal flare. In the weeks that followed, the bar remained open, the camera remained running, and people kept drinking beneath the shadow of a mystery. Flyers still hung outside the entrance. People sometimes gathered there on quiet nights, staring at the escalator, half expecting Brian to ride down. But he never did. In the first days after Brian Shaffer disappeared, the Columbus Police Department treated the case like many others. A young man had gone out drinking and hadn't returned. Maybe he'd slept somewhere unexpected. Maybe he'd had too much and wandered off. Or maybe, just maybe, he'd chosen to disappear on his own. But by the end of the first week, those maybes began to collapse under scrutiny. There was no sign of Brian, not a trace. And for every question answered, two more emerged. Detectives quickly realized that this was not a typical missing persons case. It was the start of one of the most confounding disappearances in modern American history. The lead detective on the case, Andre Edwards, had seen hundreds of missing persons reports in his time. Runaways, abductions, people lost to addiction or violence. But this was different. There was no crime scene, no note, no reason, no departure. Brian simply stepped into a public space and ceased to exist within it. Everything about this case is odd. Edwards later said in an interview, if you wanted to vanish, You couldn't have chosen a more difficult place to do it. Investigators canvassed the entire South Campus Gateway, checking every camera in business for footage. They searched dumpsters, rooftops, storm drains, and service corridors. Nothing. Dogs trained to find bodies or trace human scent found nothing conclusive. Not a single clue suggested where Brian had gone. In any missing person case, those closest to the individual are the first to be examined. The theory is simple. People don't just vanish. They are taken or choose to go. Either way, the answer often lies with someone who knew them best. Police interviewed Brian's girlfriend, Alexis Wagoner, multiple times. She was devastated, cooperative, and consistent in every version of events. Her story never changed. She was at home studying for an exam the night Brian went missing. Phone records confirmed her location. No one, not even the most skeptical investigators, believed she had any involvement. His brother Derek, equally devastated, told police that Brian had seemed off since their mother's death, but not dangerously so. They had planned to hang out during the break. Brian had promised they'd catch up before the trip to Miami. He wasn't suicidal, Derek insisted. He wasn't the type to run. Then came Clint Florence. Clint had been with Brian that night. He had seen him last. And yet, when asked to take a polygraph test, Clint refused. The refusal wasn't illegal. It wasn't even unusual. Many attorneys advise against polygraphs due to their unreliability. But in the court of public opinion, Clint's silence was thunderous. People speculated that he was hiding something. Detectives grew suspicious. But there was nothing to charge him with, nothing to hold him on. He had simply exercised his right to remain quiet. Desperate for leads, Brian's family began receiving calls from psychics. Some said he was underwater. Others claimed he was being held captive. One psychic suggested he had hit his head and had no memory of who he was. None of it led anywhere. Police followed up on dozens of these tips, knowing most were nonsense, but hoping that just one might break the case. They never did. Meanwhile, internet forums lit up with armchair detectives. People dissected the CCTV footage frame by frame. Some claimed to see a shadow that could be Brian's. Others believed the footage had been tampered with. Reddit threads ballooned with thousands of comments and theories. But online attention, while massive, brought more confusion than clarity. Throughout it all, Brian's father, Randy, became the face of the search. He printed thousands of flyers, called news stations, and gave dozens of interviews. He walked alleyways alone, talked to the homeless, and plastered Brian's face across the city. "I won't stop until I find him," he told reporters. "I just want to know what happened to my son." Randy believed his son was alive. Maybe he was being held. Maybe he had lost his memory. But he couldn't accept that Brian had simply vanished, not without help. In many ways, Randy's relentless fight kept the case alive. Without his voice, Brian's story might have faded into a file cabinet. But hope is a double-edged sword. And in the years that followed, that hope would be tested like never before. In September 2008, over 2 years after Brian vanished, tragedy struck again. Randy Shaffer, Brian's father and most determined advocate, was killed in a freak accident. A storm had brought down a tree in his yard, and it struck him as he cleared debris. The loss shattered what was left of the family. It also introduced a new chapter of cruelty. Soon after Randy's obituary was published, a message appeared on the guest book attached to his memorial site. It read, "Dad, I love you. Love, Brian, U.S. Virgin Islands." The message was quickly flagged and investigated. Police traced the post to a public computer in Franklin County. It was a hoax, a disgusting, cruel joke played by someone exploiting a family's grief. It offered no answers, only more pain. But for a moment, it reignited that flicker of hope. For a moment, people thought maybe, just maybe, Brian was alive and watching from afar. Despite the cruelty, despite the years, the memory of Brian Shaffer never faded. Each April, friends and supporters held a candlelight vigil outside the Ugly Tuna Saloona. They lit candles, shared memories, and played Pearl Jam, Brian's favorite band. They told stories about his kindness, his smile, and his dreams of becoming a doctor and traveling the world. T1 vigil, a friend said, "It's strange. The longer he's gone, the more I remember him. Not less." More. That seemed to be the case for many. Brian became more than a missing person. He became a symbol of unresolved pain, of how fragile life is, and how quickly the world can shift beneath your feet. There's no last line in Brian Shaffer's story. No closing image. No final goodbye. Instead, his case lives in a space we're never taught to navigate, between absence and memory, between fact and feeling, between what we know and what we can never prove. It's a liminal story, one that refuses an ending, and in doing so, it becomes something more. What we know that Brian Shaffer was a 27-year-old medical student, smart and driven, grieving his mother, deeply in love, and looking toward the future. We know he entered a bar in Columbus, Ohio, around 1:15 a.m. on April 1st, 2006, and was never seen leaving. We know the cameras should have captured him, but they didn't. We know there was no evidence of foul play, no signs of suicide, no financial or digital activity, no confirmed sightings since that night. We know the last words he ever spoke, at least to someone we know of, were to two young women just outside the Ugly Tuna Saloona. He smiled. He seemed fine. And then he stepped back inside. What we don't know, everything else, where he went, what happened, whether he's alive, whether someone helped him disappear or made him disappear. We don't know if he left on foot, through a back corridor, dressed differently. We don't know if he was removed by force. We don't know if he ever even left the building that night. We don't know if he meant to disappear, or if someone took that choice away from him. The hardest part is the silence. Brian's memory lives in many forms. In the voice of his brother Derek, who still speaks of him in interviews with a quiet pain that hasn't dulled with time. In the gentle eyes of Alexis, who moved on with life, but never stopped believing that love, real love, deserves answers. In the father who died searching, never giving up, whose final years were spent in alleyways and across police stations, simply asking, "Where's my son?" And in the millions of strangers who discovered Brian's case online, who saw his face for the first time and never forgot it, who couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, had no something. Because people don't just disappear. Do they? Could Brian still be alive? Drop your theories below and hit that bell icon so you don't miss what's coming next.